Japan, a place of culture, ideas, and innovation. Like other civilizations, Japan has changed and evolved over its long life. This time period will introduce Japan to the intellectual, technological, and agricultural advances that had been seen throughout the world. With other nations increasing industrialization and spreading their power, Japan was forced to rapidly expand and discover new technologies. Thus began Japan. The decline of the Tokugawa Bofuku came with famine, crop failures, and harsh taxation. Many cultivators during this time supplied rice and other agricultural products to the people across the empire. Agriculture was the foundation of the empire, so much of the taxes were paid first in grain. However, many cultivators became very poor, and this number was increasing drastically due to the famine. Due to lacks of crops and the success of the agriculture industry, many cultivators soon started to move to the cities and towns to find other work where they could support themselves and their families. Although industrial jobs were increasing, the conditions were not any better. Across the empire, samurai and daimyo began to lose social status and lose money from the increasing wealth and power among the merchant class. Between 1841 and 1843, Mizuno Tadawani tried to make reforms to better the economy, but this had increasing backlash and soon forced him out of his position. With the decline of the Tawagana, both foreign and local influences forced drastic changes in the political, economic, and social region at this time. In 1844, French, British, and American ships started to arrive and make relations with the Japanese people. The Americans asked if they could establish a port for its whaling and Pacific fleets. This was denied by the Tokugawa government, which then caused Commodore Matthew C. Perry, an American commander, to point his guns at the Edo, and caused the Tokugawa government to accept unequal treaties, in which the nations of Britain, Netherlands, and Russia were also given. By accepting these unequal treaties, they were deemed to be unworthy of leading Japan. A brief civil war took place, which caused the shogun to resign. Emperor Mudashita was crowned, and the Meiji reform brought power to the emperor and eliminated their previous series of military governments. Along with demands made by foreign empires, there were many local demands made by the Japanese people. Many rebellions took place, one of which is the Satsuma Rebellion, which was a revolt against the new imperial government by samurai that felt that they had been betrayed due to the reforms made by the empire. During the Meiji era, the Satsuma domain was a place where many unemployed samurai lived after the military reforms destroyed the status of the samurai. This then led to the samurai trying to revolt against the Meiji government. The Meiji government soon took down the rebellion and was able to end the monopoly on military control that the samurai and daimyo had held in Japan. Along with the social rebellions going on during this time, many economic changes began to arise as well. Economic innovations began to arise, and the Meiji saw that the economy was the foundation for a strong nation. Barriers on commerce were now removed and trade was increased. Along with this, the government created new systems of transportation, such as trains and steamships that would help connect to the economic network in Japan. Also, new communication with telegraphs and education, which all improved life throughout the empire. Literacy improved throughout the empire, and universities allowed for an increase in the science and technological field of study. All these improvements helped boost the economy in the country overall. Along with this, the new infrastructure allowed for a rapid industrialization and economic growth that Japan had been longing for. Most enterprises were privately owned. The empire put in programs that would further stimulate industrial development. Eventually, the government sold many of its enterprises to private investors who had connections to the government officials, which led to a large concentration of wealth. This led to a small group of wealthy individuals known as Zabihu. By the early 20th century, Japan had a major industrial power. Another major change that affected the common people was the conversion of currency. The government converted their currency from grain into a more standardized currency, which allowed them to get a more predictable revenue. Peasants had to supply a majority of the domestic capital, and this inequality eventually led to many peasant revolts. The labor-intensive industry was staffed by poorly paid workers. Hundreds of thousands of families were living in poverty, affected by malnutrition, infanticide, and starvation. Many of these changes and problems led to revolts and rebellions. Along with this, foreign influences began to change between the Americans, Spanish, and Portuguese. In this year, 1896, a widespread revolt in the Philippines by the local people occurred. The U.S. sent a fleet of ships to help the Philippines in the revolt and beat the Spanish in the Philippines. The United States, after sending out the Spanish, took over the Philippines as an empire of their own. Jealous of Portugal and Spain's access to trade routes, other Western European nations such as the Netherlands, France, and the English began to send rival expeditions to Asia. Other European nations started to make expeditions to Asia as the Spanish and Portuguese trade in the Indian Ocean was beginning to diminish. This happened mostly because the Spanish and Portuguese were becoming financially overstressed because of the contemporary naval technology and investing capacity, using control of the Indian Ocean trade to be very expensive. One way in which Japan and many other empires had drastically improved their empire and increased its power was through the introduction of capitalism. Capitalism was introduced to Japan as they adapted the ways of Western civilization. Capitalism was the fuel of industrialism. Wealthy business owners during this period of rapid industrialization were able to grow and profit. Division of labor allowed labor productivity to increase. The job of farmers and most peasants became obsolete as they were forced into a system of labor which provided low wages. Cheap labor allowed business owners to turn a profit at faster rates. Although this system benefited the wealthy businessman, the lower class citizens of Japan were forced to work in harsher conditions for minimal pay. This caused frustration among the working class as they received low wages and were forced to supply the majority of domestic capital to their society. Subsequently, this led to many peasant rebellions and uprisings that were commonly cut short by the government.
Still, Japan compared to other industrial nations was lacking. Industrialization helped countries throughout this time. New technologies made processes much more efficient and easier to complete. The West had many advantages over Japan because they had been exposed to these new tech ideas and technologies far long before Japan had. Japan had closed its borders before from the conservative daimyo. This kept outside ideas and technologies far away from Japan, which ultimately had negative consequences for Japan. However, now that Japan opened its ports and removed many of the policies that limited trade and communication, industrialization and new ideas began to expand rapidly. Japan had now become another industrial power, but the West still continued to be far more advanced in many technologies and ideas. But still, Japan started to expand its power.
Japan seemed to be able to control its people and start to a industrialization that boosted their nation. After harsh conditions and a declining Tokugawa Empire, Japan was able to establish a government that helped fight against unequal treaties that were given to them. A industrial Japan allowed for Japan to become a rising power in world affairs. With the emergence of Japan, America seemed to also seek and establish their own control of Asia, gaining power in the Philippines and other lands that were conquered by Spain. With better educated people, better transportation, communication, and technology, Japan was able to prosper and continue to grow after the industrial era. Thus concludes Japan, a country full of innovation and a rich history.